Hello. Oh, I'm on.
You're on.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chelsea, and I'm one of the curators here at ACMI. So first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome everyone to our ACMI Conversations Interpreting Alice, a dissection of the myriad of meanings found in the text this evening. We're really so excited and thrilled that we can have this conversation, so thank you for joining us, everyone. I'm not sure how many people have gone downstairs as yet to our Wonderland Exhibition, but within it we explore the many different moving image representations of Alice on screen. Since first gracing the silver screen in 1903, Alice has delighted audiences with more than 40 art house and blockbuster films, not to mention her influences across mediums, cultures, and of course within the world of special effects. Since the earliest interpretations, makers have constantly pushed the boundaries of craft in grappling with the many illusions and ideas that Lewis Carroll has embedded within the text. The wide variety of films, television shows, music videos, and games are really testament to the, wide variety and innumerable theories of Alice within the world of Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce Mel Campbell tonight, who is going to be sort of chairing our talk. So Mel is a freelance journalist and critic who co-hosts the fortnightly literature and culture podcast, The Rereaders. Mel is a columnist on writing at the Overland magazine, a lecturer in editing and publishing at La Trobe University, and a writer on film, TV, and media at Junkie. The Big Issue, Crikey, Metro, The Guardian, and many, many more.
Many, many more.
Her first book was the non-fiction investigation Out of Shape, debunking myths around fashion and fit, and she's the co-author of the romantic comedy novel The Hot Guy. So, before we start, a few housekeeping notes. There'll be a Q&A at the end of the session. Please stick around. And it is being recorded, so I ask if you could please wait for the mic till you ask your question so that everybody on the record but also on our live stream can hear the event and hear your questions. And also, this room is fantastic. We love it, but it's a little bit technical. If you want to exit at any point, please don't go through the door that you've just entered. If you come around to this door over here, our fantastic VSO Baha will help you out. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over. Thank you again for coming. We very much appreciate it and enjoy.
Thank you. Can I get a show of hands? Who has actually had a chance to check out ACMI's Wonderland Exhibition? Oh, it's kind of a bit half and half here. I'm pleased that my fellow panellists also put their hands up. What strikes me about ACMI's exhibition is that it's focused on the magic of Wonderland as a space where the impossible can be made possible, and special effects do the same thing. They create a sense of possibility. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about technology, but we're also going to be talking about that other wonderful mechanism for making the impossible possible, the human mind. Whoa, I know, right? So before we get started, I wanted to give you just a little bit of a background on some of the issues that have come up over time when we're talking about Alice in Wonderland before I introduce our panellists, who are each going to give a presentation based on their own areas of expertise, and we'll have a discussion among us after each of those presentations. Keep your questions in mind, because I'd like you to hold those questions until the end of the presentation rather than having them after each individual presentation. So just keep them in your wonderful mechanism. But when we're thinking about Alice in Wonderland, we're often thinking about the films and the other media that have come after it. Have you also noticed my special Alice in Wonderland themed earrings. It's such an iconic sense of imagery that partly has to do with Tenniel's illustrations of some of the early editions of the book, particularly the ones in which Alice is wearing a blue dress, because she wasn't always wearing a blue dress. In some of them she's wearing a yellow dress, a buttercup or butter yellow dress, which is fascinating as well. So we have to cast our eye back in time to a boating trip that happened along the Thames in 1862 on July 4th. And this was where Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, better known as Lewis Carroll, was having a boating trip with some of his friends and with the sisters of the Liddell family, with whom he had become friendly. Alice Liddell, obviously, is the namesake of this book, but she had several other siblings as well. To entertain the girls, he made up this story, and then he went away and workshopped it, and in 1865 it was published as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And then we had the other sequel volume, which was Alice Through the Looking Glass, Further Adventures Through Wonderland. Now, Dodgson was a very interesting character, and maybe we can tease out some of the things that made him interesting. But it's important to note that some of the things in the book have to do with the Cambridge, which is where all this was happening. So, Oxford. Dodgson attended Christ College at Oxford and later on became a teacher of mathematics there. And he became mates with Alice's parents and with other people in the university. So the King of Hearts is basically an analogy, some people say, for Henry Liddell, Alice's dad, and her mum is the Queen of Hearts. So when you think about the unflattering portrayals of the King and Queen of Hearts, it might give you an idea as to Lewis Carroll's opinion of Alice's parents. And it's also perhaps worthwhile to mention here that there was a feud between him and the Liddells that led them to break off their friendship in 1863 later on. Some say that it's because Lewis Carroll, who never married, might have asked for Alice's hand in marriage and her parents refused. But again, there are mysterious clues in his diaries and in other writings that were made around the time, but this is something that is shrouded in mystery. The White Rabbit, who appears as this fretful figure who's late for a very important date, we know in some of the later adaptations, might also be a representation of Alice Liddell's doctor, Dr. Ackland, who was the Regius Professor of Medicine at Christchurch College. And the rabbit hole in the story might symbolise the actual stairs in the back of the main hall at Christchurch. When we think about some of the things that Alice does, she goes to tea parties, she plays croquet. These are some of the things that the real child Alice would have enjoyed. And some of the characters, if you'll remember that there's a duck, a dodo, Laurie and Eaglet, who are sort of characters who go in the pool of tears and are upset. This might be, some say, a reference to a real-life boating expedition that ended in a similar watery wet disaster, with parts including Dodgson himself and the Reverend Robinson Duckworth, who was a mate of his. So they are the duck and dodo of this story. And then Alice's sisters, Lorena and Edith, feature as Laurie and the Eaglet in that story. And so there's a description of them emerging dripping wet, cross and comfortable. That is apparently what actually happened on this trip. So we can see that this is actually something that's about Cambridge itself, and as a space where the teller of the story and the listeners of the original story were all familiar with. And it's kind of almost about in-jokes, really. But some have also said that we can't consider this story without considering its background in Victoria, in Victorian England, that is. And so are these characters that Alice encounters allegories for different political forces, whether they're actual individuals or whether they are different political actors at that time? So, for instance, the Queen might represent Queen Victoria, who was very short, was famous for her short temper as well, and she was very fond of ordering people about. But the shambolic legal system of Wonderland, in which everything is a nonsense, could also be a critique of the legal system and the bureaucracy that reigned in England at the time. If you're familiar with the ideas of the walrus and the carpenter and the story they tell about the oysters that they lure out onto a little walk with the intention, they say, of understanding other things, cabbages and kings, only to basically eat them. So some say that the walrus and the carpenter represent the UK and the US at this period in time, and both have a vested interest in gobbling up other countries and other resources for themselves. Some also say that the Queen and her garden with white roses that have to hastily be camouflaged as red roses is a reference to the Wars of the Roses in England's history, the houses of York and Lancaster, which were represented by a white rose and a red rose, and of course united by the House of Tudor, which was a white and a red rose. So again, we can see that who knows ultimately what is in someone's mind when they invent a book. They're telling a fun story, but they're also telling an allegory sometimes. And so when we ourselves, hundreds of years later, are looking at Alice in Wonderland, are we talking about our own time now, or are we talking about the time when the story was made? So it's very easy for us to impose our own ideas and our own theories on this book that might not have been at all what the author intends. But of course, when we come to postmodernist literary critique, it doesn't have to do with what the author intended. It might also be to do with the society that we live in, because we, the readers, are interpreting things based on what we believe and what the forces are in our own societies. So some of the other things that Alice has in throughout time been associated with might be with themes of adulthood and childhood. I don't want to get too psychoanalytical and be talking about the rabbit hole that she goes down as being a kind of a sexual symbol. I'm not going to talk about that. But think about how Alice grows bigger and she grows smaller, and about how adulthood is sometimes about feeling small in situations where you used to feel big, or about when you're a child, you feel small among all the other big people and you feel powerless. Think about how Lewis Carroll never married and often felt like he was most at home with other children. Maybe he is like Alice when she's large, trying to squeeze into a place where he wants to belong but no longer feels that he does. But also, think about the way that Alice is constantly being confronted with a nonsense. Like everything that she understands or thinks is true is turned on its head. And everyone she encounters is not in a position to help her. It's kind of up to Alice to help herself to figure out what's right, which you can argue is what it is to grow up, what it means to be an adult in the world. And her sense of curiosity, her sense that things are curiouser and curiouser, is kind of part of a child's way of looking at the world. But she's often told by everyone around her that her curiosity is going to get her into trouble. And she's really told off by all the authority figures that she encounters within Wonderland. Everything that she comes across is told that it's wrong. So perhaps it's about feeling uncomfortable in your body, but it's also about feeling that who you are and how you relate to everyone else is constantly changing and is never making sense. So we can talk a little bit more about more of the actual psychology of that a little bit later. So I've talked about in-jokes, I've talked about political allegory, and I've also talked about ideas of childhood. But now it is time to get into some of the more specialist ideas, for which we must introduce our opening speaker, who is Professor Nick Haslam. Now, Nick is a professor of psychology at the University of Melbourne, and he is a past head of the department, the School of Psychological Sciences at that university. Now, Nick trained in the United States and also worked in the United States until 2002. He trained at the University of Pennsylvania, received his PhD in clinical and social psychology there, and taught at the New School for Social Research in New York for several years. But now he's back. He's back in Australia, and he's no longer working in the clinical sphere. He's strictly a research professor. His research interests include personality, social perception, and psychiatric classification. So I'm very curiouser to see what he makes of Alice in Wonderland. Now, in addition to publishing extensively within the psychological literature, you might have come across some of Nick's writings at The Conversation, and I encourage you to check those out if you ever are able to find them. He's also written for The Monthly, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Australian, and he has appeared in 2 Best Australian Science Writing anthologies. But most interestingly for me, he's recently published something in Time magazine that's about reading on the toilet. So Nick talks about the big topics, and I'm really keen to hear what he's going to have to say about Alice. Please make Nick welcome.
Well, thank you for that very generous intro, Mel. And I mean, Alice is a big question as well. So I think you might think this is just some sort of curiosity, but I think it has some really interesting psychological dimensions. And I was asked to speak about the psychology and maybe neuroscience of Alice. And I thought I'd just start by saying something which I didn't know until about a week ago. There's actually a syndrome named after this book called Alice in Wonderland Syndrome. And I should put my specs back on so I can actually read what's here. But here's a few quotes from people afflicted by this rather rare syndrome. It's only about 200 people have actually had their cases written up on this, but I'll read this for those of you who are feeling a bit lazy. Often preceding and during the migraine attack, I've had a very peculiar feeling of being very close to the ground as I walk along. It's as though I was short and wide, like Queen Victoria, as the reflection in one of those broadening mirrors one sees in carnivals. Sometimes I feel myself to be 6 inches tall, and sometimes 12 feet. She was occasionally conscious of an illusory feeling that her feet were a yard long or that she was going up or downhill when actually walking over flat ground. I get tired from pulling my head down from the ceiling. My head feels like a balloon. These are actual quotes from actual patients. While seated, the patient felt her 4 limbs growing longer in a bilateral and symmetrical way, and her trunk, not an elephant, enlarging to make her more straight and like draped with a long train. While standing, she perceived the floor as distant and soft and felt she had a very light walk, full of ease or like on stilts. And if you read these sorts of experiences, and there are lots of other ones where people thought that their head had shrunk to the size of an orange, other amusing kinds of experiences, although they would be quite terrifying if you had them yourself, you'll see the connection to the sort of experiences that Alice goes through in this wonderful book. This syndrome was identified in the 1950s by a psychiatrist, and he said that there were a few cardinal features of the syndrome. So the major ones are distortions of what's called the body schema, this sort of idea or the image that we have in our minds and our brains about what the body looks like, and how if it gets distorted we see things differently from how they objectively are. But it's not the only thing. So in addition, there's a kind of confusion that the person experiences where they feel a deep sense of unreality of the world and also an unreality of themselves, derealization, depersonalization. Often time accelerates or slows down, so it's not only space that's distorted, it's also time. But really vision in general undergoes a kind of alteration there. So objects are seen as being larger or smaller than they are in size. Sometimes colour is seen either in a very diluted kind of way or completely bleached out into monochrome or very vivid. There's even symptoms where people see nothing but green or nothing but purple or nothing but yellow. There are things where people see wavy lines, illusory movement, sometimes exaggerated sense of the detail of objects, or seeing objects as further away, and you get this remarkable, very discombobulating kind of experience that comes along in this syndrome. And of course, you get some wonderful long names, which psychiatrists and neurologists, and to a lesser extent psychologists, do all the time. Macrosomatic nausea, it means feeling that your body is bigger than it really is. And so total body macrosomatic nausea, say that 10 times fast, is sort of what, here's an example from Alice. She's eaten the cake or drunk the drink, I forget which made her bigger, and she's crammed into the room. And that's an experience which is not at all uncommon among people who have this syndrome. Or you get the reverse, the total body microsomatic nausea, feeling that your body is smaller than it really is, like in some of the quotes we saw. Or you get those partial ones. Again, the word's so long it doesn't even fit on a slide, where you'll see that, and the famous case here again is where Alice eats something or other. This may have been the mushroom, I think, that did this, where her neck becomes so long that a pigeon in the canopy thinks it's a serpent and wants to fly away. And all of these things actually are experienced in this syndrome. And it's caused by all sorts of things as well. So you might think that one syndrome has one particular cause, but actually it's most commonly experienced in the context of migraine headaches, sometimes in epilepsy, sometimes in the context of a viral infection or encephalitis. Brain lesions can cause it, defects in the visual system directly can cause it, or even in the middle ear, which is responsible for things like balance. Sometimes you'll see it in the context of mental illness, like depression or schizophrenia, and sometimes it comes on episodically with people who are under the influence of LSD or cannabis or cough syrup, if you want a cheap high. And, you know, you actually see this in real life. So, believe it or not, there was a contest a while ago for Migraine Art. They solicited images from drawings from people who wanted to describe their experience of having migraines. And you see, or the mental state that precedes the headache itself. And you hear a couple of the examples of this, of partial macrosomatoagnosia. Often the head is enlarged like this. This is the picture on the left relative to the body. So you see something a little bit like Alice with the elongated neck. The case on the right is someone who felt that her arms had got unnaturally long in the context of a migraine attack that was coming along. So these things are actually experienced. The interesting thing that seems to be going on in the brain is that there's some sort of alteration in the brain's map of the body. So on your somatosensory cortex, it's called, if you look at the left image, there's a representation according to where in the brain the different parts of the body's sensation are encoded, and parts of the body where tactile sensation is sort of more important, or where the map, if you like, is in finer detail, have more space in the brain. So if you look at this sort of map, the face takes up a lot of space, the hand quite a bit, the tongue quite a bit, but the trunk, legs, feet, not so much. You get a distorted idea of what the body looks like. And what seems to be going on in this Alice in Wonderland syndrome is somehow this kind of map is not translating in the normal way into the objective dimensions of the body. And it's actually even more different if you look at the next fold of the brain along, which is responsible for the image of movement, where the hand and the face are huge. And you can actually picture it up like this. These strange little creatures are representations of what the body would look like if they were proportional to how the brain represents the different parts of them. And you'll see that oversized head, oversized hands, and this is again maybe what's going on somehow in this syndrome, that there's a distortion in the relative size of these parts of the body. So why would I say all this? Well, one theory about what Dodgson was expressing in the sort of fantastical aspects of Alice was his own personal experience of migraines. And there's good evidence that he actually had experienced migraines. He called them bilious headaches, bilious because he actually threw up frequently before them, and that he experienced visual auras, which is not just the sort of angelic thing over the heads of my colleagues here, but the sort of unusual sensory experiences preceding the headache. And he saw some of these sorts of things that you might see in Alice in Wonderland symptoms. Moving fortifications, must be some sort of jagged castle-like thing moving across his eyes. And it also appears that he had some sort of defect in his visual system, which might be associated with that. How we know this is because this migraine theory of Alice it was controversial because there was suggestions that he hadn't actually shown the symptom until after he'd written the great books. But it turns out that actually prior to writing Alice, he had some. He consulted an oculist, a famous one, who found evidence that there was some sort of missing part of his visual field. Revealed in this image he drew in a little chronicle he wrote called Mishmash, where you'll see the sort of the side of the face of this image and also the shoulder and the hand is simply missing. Now, it could be that he sort of had to dash off and watch his favourite TV show. More likely, he simply didn't see it. You often see people who have this sort of absence in their visual field, simply not completing drawings like this. So there was some sort of unusual aspect of his visual system, and that could have manifested itself in unusual migraine type experiences. And so he maybe knew whereof he spoke when he wrote the unusual distorted sensory experiences that Alice goes through in Alice. There are other theories about sort of why elements of this book, and I guess Mel alluded to some of this, of course. There have been suggestions that there was something a little bit odd about Dodgson's sexuality. He didn't like adults very much, it's true. He had a terrible stammer, so he was very socially awkward, but he also didn't like little boys. He much preferred the company of little girls. That doesn't mean it was necessarily anything but innocent. He simply liked their company, but of course there have been speculations, and although we don't know for sure, he may well have asked Alice's parents to wed Alice, or at least the closeness of their relationship may have troubled them, but certainly they banned him from seeing her at some point. And if you want to get into the psychoanalysis of it, and that's not my preferred way of thinking about it, but for historical reasons, a lot of writers have written about how there seemed to be a kind of sexual dimension to Alice. Again, all of the holes and tunnels, but also keys and locks. And so there's a quote from a famous psychoanalyst from back 40s or 50s about what the lock and key means. You remember at the very start of the picture, the book, not the picture. Start of the book, there's this issue of not being able to open the right door with the right key, and so on. So you can fill in the blanks there. Another theory has to do with the idea that this is actually a very savage book. So Paul Schilder was an Austrian psychoanalyst in the 1930s who wrote the first sort of major psychoanalytic piece about Alice in Wonderland. And his area of expertise was how people form an image of their body, how we have to construct an image of our body. We have to construct that map in the first place. And often people who have psychotic disorders have a sort of disintegrated sense of what their body's like. It doesn't all come together. And what Schilder said was going on in Alice in Wonderland was really there's a huge amount of cruelty, there's a huge amount of destructiveness and disintegration of bodies, or threatened disintegration of bodies. Of course, Alice's body stretches in all sorts of elastic ways. There's lots of threats of being decapitated. All along the way, there's lots of animals being savagely devoured by other animals. There's a cat that sort of loses most of its substance. There's, of course, in Through the Looking Glass, Humpty Dumpty comes to a pretty grisly end. And he would basically, he felt this was a bad book for children. Schilder thought there was too much aggression in this book. And of course we can laugh at that these days. But the idea was essentially, he was saying children do come to sort of master this of savagery by playing with it in the form of the book, and come to get a sense of the integrity of the body, if you like, through having it challenged in these sort of spectacular, weird, fantastical ways. And the final idea, which I think again Mel alluded to, some of the later analysts thought that the book was more about the mastery of self, developing a sense of identity. So often Alice is asked in the book, who are you? Different creatures ask her, who are you? And she has a lot of trouble answering. And even at one point thinks she must have turned into her friend Mabel, who I think is a bit thick and can't do multiplication tables or remember poems or things like that. There's a whole lot of identity confusion early in the book. But I think as the book moves through, at least according to two analysts, both called Phyllis, there's a sort of sense of overcoming obstacles, developing a sense of self, mastering uncertainties, and out of this sort of chaos, which is probably what, at some level, children experience early in life, this sort of befuddling reality of the adult world, gradually they come to a sense of understanding. So it's sort of a metaphor, if you like, of growing up. At least that's one reading.
Wow, thank you, Nick. So I'm curious about you. I keep using that word. What do you think is plausible? Like yourself, when you read Alice in Wonderland, what do you see as a diagnostician, perhaps, or someone with that a psychological background.
Before I say that, I've missed a slide. You've reminded me.
Oh, did you?
So while we're diagnosing... Sorry, we didn't coordinate on that. I will get onto that, I promise, but I prepared a slide, so I must talk to it. While there's been a lot of sort of flippant diagnosis, I should say, of some of the other characters, and so people have written about the mock turtle as a chronic depressive, and people have written about the dormouse as having chronic somnolence due to sleep apnea, and there's even been a case made that by putting him in the teapot, he was somehow opening his pharynx to allow him to breathe more easily. The one last thing, I know I'm probably using more than my allotted time, the Mad Hatter, apparently hatters often were mad in those days because you used mercury to stiffen the felt in hats, and in order to steam the hats onto the head mould, there'd be a lot of vaporised mercury in the air, which is not very good for one's brain, which might turn you a little bit strange. As for my own diagnosis, look, I think it's really... I don't think it really helps anyone much to diagnose any of either the characters, who are after all fictional, or even Dodgson. I think really it's just a book that's just incredibly amusing, and I guess what turns me on about it is not so much the psychology of it, as just the spirit of play, the imaginativeness, and all of the clever wordplay especially. I think it's for people who like words, who like reading, who feel for Dodgson, because I think the reason it was claimed by his oculist that he had the bad eyes was that he read too much. For people who have some sympathy with that, that's what I love. I love just the play with words and the play with ideas, and the idea that, you know, this is something that children lap up.
Well, it's interesting that you should talk about the play with words, because our next speaker is going to be talking about the play with numbers and the play with mathematical and scientific, or physics specifically, principles. It's Stephanie Pradier, who has a most interesting career. Stephanie is privileged to be the communications manager at the Australia and New Zealand Cooperative Research Centre for Spatial Information. So pretty much any project that is being worked on by a combo of academic, private and government investment and brain power, Stephanie sort of has a hand in if it has something to do with spatial issues were located in space. So she works on everything from GPS work to facial mapping that has medical or health sciences implications, to sort of epidemiological mapping that allows people with health conditions to figure out if they're working in a danger zone. But she can probably talk much more about the specifics of what she does. But her background is interesting too, because Stephanie straddles the arts and the sciences. Her arts degree involved philosophy and journalism, and her science degree involved mathematics and physics. So really, Steph, you are ideally placed to talk about Alice in Wonderland. But as a science communicator, I'm really super excited to see what kind of normal, easily understandable ideas you can pick out of some very complex ideas in the book.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Mel. I hope I do everyone a good thing. I've got notes because I like to be prepared, so I'm going to talk to you all about the mathematics in Alice in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll was more than the nom de plume of the Oxford mathematician, the Reverend Charles Lewis Dodgson. Carroll was his alter ego, an independent character that he used to express ideas which did not fit well with a man known to be an intellectual conservative. An intellectual conservative, well connected with the academic, artistic and religious worlds of the time. Like Barry Humphries and Dame Edna Everage, the creation has become more widely known than the creator because of their eccentric and often nonsensical view of the world. Dodgson publicly denied that he was Carroll, rather as Humphries and Everage sometimes snipe about each other on television chat shows. But while Dodgson was certainly an able mathematician, it was the work of Carroll that endures. Dodgson loved puzzles and puns, and the creation of his identity of Lewis Carroll is no exception. He submitted a number of options to his publishers, but the one that was used comes from the Latin translation of his two first names, Charles Lutwidge, Carolus Ludovicius, and then he reversed the words and anglicised them to the familiar pen name that we all know, Lewis Carroll. In his work as a lecturer in mathematics at Christ Church College, Oxford, between the years 1885 and 1881, Dodgson found himself engaged in a discipline that was undergoing rapid change. Now, some of you might not know, but when you study mathematics at Oxford, you actually do so in a Bachelor of Arts, not a Bachelor of Science. Mathematics had developed mainly to describe the physical world through the union of arithmetic, geometry, and algebra. But during the 1800s, it began to embrace abstraction in pursuit of deeper foundations. What we know about Dodgson is his devotion to the classical geometrical principles of Euclid's writings in the Elements. From a small number of fundamental principles, we can all derive the Euclidean geometry that we use, knowingly or not, to describe the shapes and locations of real objects using coordinates and a set of axes. These are mathematical expressions of our everyday notions of lengths and directions, the directions left, right, up and down, forwards and backwards. Now, any challenge to the methods of Euclid was absurd to Dodgson. So, what may have begun as a harmless, entertaining story told to children by the banks of the Isis in Oxford became, in its printed form of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, a subversive commentary on what Dodgson saw as the imprecision of these new directions in mathematics. The very best of Carroll's writings are sly, witty attacks on new trends that challenged the certainties of his classically trained mind. When he wrote about these certainties, such as religious faith, mathematical principles, or social problems, Dodgson could be best described as worthy, but rather dull. Dodgson was a shy man, and we've all discussed this tonight, but when he wrote as Carroll, he was at his best when he fashioned ridicule within riddles. Superficially, Alice is an amusing nonsense story, and its style may be regarded as a precursor to 20th century English absurdist humour of the Goons, Monty Python, and Douglas Adams. At its heart, however, it is intended to be a demonstration, loosely employing the mathematical technique of reductio ad absurdum, of what Dodgson regarded as the shaky intellectual foundations of this new mathematics. The absurd scenes in Alice are intended to tell us just how absurd these new ideas really are. They are most readily understood by the fortunate elite who had absorbed the classical geometry of Euclid and enjoyed the rigorous education afforded by an English private school or the personal tuition offered by an Oxford college. Alice is a whimsy designed for a sophisticated mathematical audience who are already in on the joke. In Alice, Carroll directed his scorn at a few emerging fields of mathematics, but as I only have a short time tonight, and I probably will go over as well, I'm only going to describe two. The symbolic algebra that had been established by Augustus de Morgan, and the algebra of quaternions, created by William Rowan Hamilton. The first chapter I will take you back to is Advice from a Caterpillar. Most people think that this scene is about drugs, and that's reasonable. I mean, Alice comes across a caterpillar, smoking a hookah, sitting atop a magic mushroom. However, our first clue that this scene is about Dodgson's dismay at the absurdity of symbolic algebra is the pipe itself. The word hookah is of Arabic origin, as is the word algebra. The Western architect of symbolic algebra was British mathematician Augustus de Morgan. He laid out the first consistent rules of symbolic algebra in his 1849 manuscript Trigonometry and Double Algebra, citing the Arabic work, and I asked a couple of the guys at my work to help me with the pronunciation, so hopefully I get it right, Hisab al-Dra wa al-Muqbala, or restoration and reduction, which is exactly what happens in this chapter. Alice arrives at the caterpillar looking to restore her size. She is but 3 inches tall. And when she eats the mushroom, reduction is what she got. Her chin hits her shoe. Symbolic algebra is what we use today. It is the language for communication between mathematical objects. These objects do not have to be related in the slightest to physical quantities, and that's what changed in the 1800s. De Morgan himself thought that these results were unintelligible and absurd, but he explained, just as our heroine's encounter unfolds, that even though algebra had been reduced to a seemingly absurd but logical set of operations, eventually some sort of meaning would be restored. Symbolic algebra, or if you wiki it tonight, look up abstract or computer algebra, is the language that runs our computers, our economies, and our digital worlds. So, not necessarily a scene about drugs, but one that highlights the departure from universal arithmetic, where algebraic symbols stood for specific numbers fixed in physical quantities. After a short stop at the Duchess's house and a quick sniff of the continuity principle, Alice takes the path to the Mad Hatter's tea party. For those unaware, this chapter was not in the book that Dodgson presented to Alice Little. It only appeared in the printed text. The significance of this chapter surrounds the move from Euclidean to non-Euclidean geometry, and the idea that scholars had now begun to use seemingly nonsensical concepts such as imaginary numbers, which is the square root of a negative number, which of course can't represent a physical quantity like a fraction or a whole number, and they've been using them a lot. Can everyone understand why the square root of a negative number is absurd? Yeah? Because if, when you square all numbers, even the negative ones are positive. It's two numbers multiplied together, even when they're negative, are positive. Cool. So, in 1843, William Hamilton introduced a fourth dimension and a new system to mathematics. This system, called quaternions, was the first significant number system that did not obey the laws of ordinary arithmetic. Quaternions are also a fundamental basis for modern theories of space-time. More on time later. Let's get back to the arithmetic. The easiest way to grasp the change to the normal laws of arithmetic is with what we call, we being people like me, non-commutative multiplication. Put simply, A times B did not necessarily equal B times A anymore. Absurd, right? Dodgson draws attention to this change at the tea party through language and inverses, when Alice is told to say what she means by the March Hare. I do, she says. At least, I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know. To which the Hatter responds, not the same thing a bit. Why, you might as well say, I see what I eat is the same as I eat what I see. The March Hare adds, you might as well say, I like what I get is the same as I get what I like. And we mustn't forget our sleepy dormouse, who chimes in, and this is my favourite, hence why it's on the slide. You might as well say, I breathe when I sleep is the same as I sleep when I breathe. So you see, Carroll uses common language and the rules of language to highlight this new mathematics where non-commutative multiplication holds. Now, what of time, this extra term? Hamilton, like most Victorians, thought it had to mean something. In the preface to his lectures on quaternions of 1853, Hamilton added a footnote. It seems, and still seems, to me natural to connect this extra spatial unit with the conception of time. So, what happened when Hamilton added this fourth dimension and this extra spatial unit? It allowed vectors. Does everyone know what a vector is? It's a line that has length and direction, so it goes somewhere. So this fourth dimension allowed vectors to rotate or move in three-dimensional space. Prior to quaternions, this couldn't happen. But explaining the mathematics of this without using mathematics and in under 10 minutes would be absolutely impossible, and I bet Alice would even agree. But I'd like you all to close your eyes and go to the Mad Hatter's tea party. Picture Carroll's 3 characters sitting around a table. Remember, time is missing. Hatter quarrelled with time, and time no longer comes for tea. Now remember, I told you that quaternions are defined by 4 numbers. So, when time goes off in a half, the Hatter, the March Hare, and the Dormouse are stuck at 6 o'clock at their 2-dimensional table, going round and round, shifting places. They cannot move out of 2-dimensional space without their 4th-dimensional friend, time. Hopefully, now you're in on the joke too. And you can all open your eyes. If you head along to the exhibition downstairs, you'll see glimpses of this in the audio-visual Tea Party production. So, Dodgson made many contributions to mathematics. Some were before their time. He published texts on symbolic logic, different to symbolic algebra. He devised the basis for the proportional voting system 100 years before it came into use. And he published very important work on logic trees, graph theory, determinants, and computer algorithms. All of these are crucial nowadays to our computer science. Dodgson was, by all accounts, a good mathematician, but he wasn't a great one. The Alice books were initially admired more for their illustrations than their literary merit, and in the 19th century did not appear in lists of popular children's books. They were full of clues and riddles and contained private messages hidden in puzzles. They were simply ahead of their time too. In the 20th century, they spawned imitators, musical, theatrical, and cinematic adaptations. The work of Melanie Bailey in her Oxford PhD thesis on Victorian literature has probably had more influence than any other in reuniting Carroll's books with their mathematical origins in Dodgson's tutorials on algebra and geometry at Christchurch College. If they were alive today, we can imagine, with the marvels of technology, Dodgson and Carroll playfully sniping at one another, as do Humphreys and Everidge, creator and creation, on television chat shows, each dismissing the significance of the other. In reality, together, they form the whole. If we could get them together, they would no doubt agree that if one may think of 6 impossible things before breakfast, then surely the rules that make up the mathematics of our world are able to be impossible, complex, imaginary, abstract, and even absurd. Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. That was amazing. One thing that struck me when I was listening to your talk was just how much of what we take for granted was the subject of fierce debate in the past, and now the scientific method is about constantly proving other methods to be not wrong, but incomplete and incorrect, and needing to constantly vectorize to create a direction for knowledge. It's kind of struck me that, do you think that Lewis Carroll was on, if you like, the losing side of thought about mathematics? Was he making fun of things that were going past his views?
I don't think he was making fun of things that were going past his views. I think he was in a time where there was rapid change going on. He was at his heart a teacher. And I think that some of the changes in the mathematics, quaternions, I mean, it's very difficult mathematics, and he would have struggled to have the tools to teach his undergraduate students what these changes were. Also, if we think back to the Victorian era, this whole idea of representing things like limits and sets that actually didn't exist in our real world were completely absurd to the time.
And that made me also think about the way that mathematics used to be an arts discipline.
Well, it still is at Oxford.
Is it?
It still is.
Why
yes.
is that? Do you know?
No, there is somebody in the audience who might be able to tell us why that is, because he also did mathematics at Oxford.
Oh, really?
But
Hands up, put your hand up, identify yourself. Up the back there. We'll expect a question from you in question time. But I was also interested about the way, Steph, that you were saying, no, this wasn't about drugs, especially when we're talking about the caterpillar.
So not necessarily about drugs.
Well, our next speaker is going to be...
All right, see ya.
Oh, nice segue, sorry.
Our next speaker is going to be looking at some of the more imaginative psychedelic imagery of Alice in Wonderland, which over the years has been claimed as a kind of psychedelic text. My thoughts shift to the song White Rabbit immediately. But let's introduce Roger Essig. Now, he's essentially an artist who specialises in visual representations of psychological and psychedelic states. So he's also interested in the science of psychedelics too. So we could talk about that in the question time. But Roger has been a kind of authority on psychedelic or responsible psychedelic drug use since 1999, and since 2014 he's been showing his visualizations, visual artworks that have been based on representing these kinds of experiences in ways that many people can see what is essentially quite a subjective experience. And so his work has appeared at White Night, Rainbow Serpent Festival, Pause Fest and many other parties, and he's also given talks about the interplay of virtual reality with psychedelics and lucid dreaming as well. And he's spoken at Melbourne's Media Lab and also at Darwin Film Festival. Now, Roger has brought along his 3D, no, it's not 3D, it's a VR kind of psychedelic experience. And if you're interested, it goes for only about
minute 30.
Yeah, a minute and a half, 90 seconds. And we have all had a go, and it's tremendous. It's wondrous. And it is based on an actual experience that Roger had. But tonight he's going to be talking about the text of Alice in Wonderland and what that might have to do with psychedelic experiences. So over to you, Roger.
Thanks, Mel. Bit of housekeeping first, like literal housekeeping. I have to move these glasses out of the way so I can actually see the screen.
I'll have my glass.
Non-psychedelic.
I'll have my glass because I'm done talking now for a little bit.
Is that yours?
Yeah.
All right. So, as you can see, these are a few photos of me. Like in Melbourne, actually, at various parties, and Alice in Wonderland kept cropping up. The top left is an Alice in Wonderland party, like the theme party. I'm not sure who I am. I'm meant to go as a pirate, but I ended up looking like Cher because the eyeshadow on. But that's the March Hare there, of course. There's me as the Mad Hatter at a chocolate-themed Alice in Wonderland party with a bit of chocolate on my nose. And at another party, this is what I usually do. I'll bring an art panel and I'll get people to join in, and this formed. It was like a caterpillar. So actually, as I was painting it, it turned into the caterpillar from Alice in Wonderland. So, yeah, it seems... Yeah, and if you think about the book, how famous it is, and it may be due partly because end of copyright laws, it could be reinterpreted or, remade in various films and stuff like that. But the fact that it's so popular may be tied into... like the mythical journey that Alice went on, because you see in other really famous books or stories, classic one is, Harry Potter, how that just blew up, I think, is she more richer than the Queen now, I think, the author? I'm not sure.
J.K. Rowling?
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's what I heard, but I'm not sure. But these stories seem to resonate so deeply, and I think that it is like a hero's journey that she went on. There is that tunnel sequence at the beginning, and ancient tribes people, they would put their children or, their adolescents into caves to let them confront their own demons and fears. So it's kind of like she's gone on this journey. Now, I don't know if Lewis Carroll intended this, but it may be a fact that this story sort of stood the test of time is because it sort of went that way, and, yeah, people can relate to these hero journeys. So what's next? All right. So, yeah, there's a lot of theories about, and a lot of them have been disproved. So getting me here to talk about his potential use of psychedelics like Lewis Carroll or any sort of drug, all the research I did came up, no, it's been sort of refuted. He didn't really, there's no indication that he had opium for his medication, although he could have had, definitely.
Because
he
it
did
is
have headaches.
migraines.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the side effects, I mean, these were given to kids. As you can see, it says laudanum for baby too. So they were, you know, people were giving like doses to children, and a lot of people were like mothers that have to work, so some of them would actually dose their baby up and let them sleep all day, you know, sleep. And so when they came back, they, you know, just a sleepy baby, I guess. Unfortunately, it didn't always work out too well because, you know, overdoses and stuff like that. So yes, there is side effects although a lot of this was mixed with alcohol, so some say that the percentage wasn't enough to cause hallucination and stuff like that. And by itself, opium isn't known as a psychedelic, really. But having said that, I think it can be. You can access parts of your mind through just stressful situations that chemicals do to your body, but it's not known as a psychedelic. What's next? So yeah, in researching this, I was looking for evidence of any indication that there was at least maybe Lewis was inspired or knew about opium, which he definitely did. He was a really famous photographer, I guess you could call him, or a really prolific photographer, and he took a lot of photos of his peers as well, like other book writers. And there was a photo of an author, and his wife had actually overdosed on opium, on laudanum, I think it was pronounced. So he definitely knew of people that, you know, indulged in that sort of thing, because she definitely indulged in overdose and stuff like that. So, and also there was I'll get onto, there's a further ahead of the slide about the author Thomas de Quincey, who wrote Confessions of an Opium Eater, and English Opium Eater. So I'll talk about that a bit later. But this was really interesting. This was his original artwork that he gave to Alice Little, the girl. The book that he hand wrote and drew pictures of. And this was, he called it a hookah, as you can see down there. But it wasn't really a hookah, it was more of a opium pipe. And you can see this incredible artwork by, I think it was a wood carving actually, by Gustave Doré, who's one of the most prolific. I've just sort of saw his artworks recently, and he's done like thousands of incredible artworks this detail, so I recommend people look him up if they don't know him already. So yeah, the similarities are very striking, I find, like pretty much the same length, you know. And then you can see in the background, I think that was from San Francisco actually, the top image. But again, you can see the opium pipe there, the length of that. So what's next? Okay, and you spoke of this, the headaches that Carroll supposedly had. And yeah, there was research done where, like a paper written about how he may have complained about these ocular migraines after the book had been written, but it says in one of it says it's the second time it happened, but he didn't mention the first in any of his diaries. So there is, yeah, and it's up for debate if he had any of these specific ocular migraines. But yeah, in looking at this, I found it really interesting. It looks like a cat smiling, if you tilt your head sideways at least. So what does it say? And I wish you wouldn't keep appearing and vanishing so suddenly. You make one quite giddy. So this is Alice. All right, said the cat, and this time it vanished quite slowly, beginning with the end of the tail and ending with the grin, which remained some time after the rest of it had gone. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat? It's the most curious thing I have ever saw in my life. Yeah. So what else? Oh yeah, so in another part of the book, he wrote, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air, it puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin. And she said to herself, it's a Cheshire cat. So in researching this, the images of this ocular migraine, they do last for several minutes, and they progressively get more vibrant. So that sort of falls into similar time frame as well. And you can see in the top right, the body distortions that person's going through, the stretching of the legs, and stuff like that. And again, it's always with these sort of curves. Is there anything else to add to that? I don't think so. But in a way, I'll be talking about the appearance of the Cheshire Cat again and how it relates to psychedelics, which could be an opium-based vision. Not that, and this is my claim, that Lewis may never had the experience, but he read authors that did. And he's a known fan of, as I said before, Thomas de Quincey, who wrote quite detailed about his experiences. And here it is, Thomas de Quincey, Confessions of an English Opium Eater. So this is his description. I thus gave the reader some slight abstraction of my oriental dreams, which always filled me with such amazement at the monstrous scenery that horror seemed absorbed for a while in sheer astonishment. Sooner or later came a reflux of feeling that swallowed up the astonishment and left me not so much in terror as in hatred and abomination of what I saw. Over every form and threat and punishment and dim slightness incarceration brooded a sense of eternity and infinity that drove me into oppression as of madness. Into these dreams only it was, with one or two slight exceptions, that any circumstance of physical horror entered. All before had been moral and spiritual terrors. But here the main agents were ugly birds or snakes or crocodiles, especially the last. The cursed crocodile became to me the object of more horror than almost all the rest. I was compelled to live with him, and, as was always the case, almost in my dreams, for centuries. Yeah, so it's like his experience seemed like, it felt like centuries, obviously. So, and yeah, that's a common theme with psychedelic uses as well. I wasn't aware that opium gave that similar effect, or that people had visions. So it's quite interesting. I escaped sometimes and found myself in the Chinese houses with cane tables. All the feet of the tables and sofas soon became instinct with life. The abominable head of the crocodile and his leering eyes looked out at me, multiplied into a thousand repetitions, and I stood loathing and fascinated. And in going through, this is kind of a coincidence maybe, or this is the original artwork by, what was the, I forget the...
Is it Tenniel?
Yeah, that's the one. So, which would have been overseen, I think, by Lewis Carroll. He may have, I'm not too sure about that.
Yeah, he got very upset
when
the first edition was printed because the quality of the images were not up to scratch.
Okay. Oh, yeah, so he was very fastidious with, I don't know if that word, with, even the book quality, like the paper that was used and all that. So he was very careful with the final product.
So this is the Jabberwocky?
Yes, that's the Jabberwocky. So I found this print of the Thomas de Quincey book, and the similarities were quite striking. And it's a common... there's the thing of chasing the dragon with opium, which I always thought was a hallucination, like as a kid when I heard about that, or a young teenager. But I since learned it's more about chasing the smoke. But then again, I think there is a dragon-esque aspect to this. Like, people can see visions, and I've definitely seen dragon-type of entities on a substance called dimethyltryptamine, which is it's a common theme to see these sort of predatory animals, and it may have something to do with which I'll talk about depending on the next slide. I always forget what it is. Oh yes, it is the one I want. So I've just found out recently about snake skin detection, what humans can do and how we've evolved to be able to notice snake skin, like the diamond pattern amongst foliage, or even if like only a small percentage of the snakes shown. We've co-evolved with snakes, when we used to live in trees, and I imagine the snakes were much bigger and we were much smaller, if you know what I mean. So it may be, this is just a hypothesis. But there's been a lot of papers talked about this, and they've done tests. I won't go into the detail of the tests because I've only read them once through and I can't really remember. But yeah, they've tested on monkeys as well. They've never experienced snakes before, and they did see a notice reaction, I guess you could say. And I myself had an experience, and in fact, one of the first people to write about this, Lynn A. Isbell. Yeah, why she researched this was she had an experience of being out, and all of a sudden she realised she was jumping backwards from a snake, and she didn't even know it was there. That happened to me like 8 months ago, a tiger snake at a friend's property. I was walking down the back of the bush with two mates behind me, and all of a sudden I was in the air, pointing, yelling out snake, and the snake and I jumped backwards at the same time. I didn't even realise it was happening until after it happened in a way. So why I'm talking about this is, my theory is, or hypothesis is, on psychedelics or even opium, when you're drowsy and half asleep or whatever like that, there's a hypergogia, I think it's pronunciation, hypergogia, the imagery that pops up as you're either falling asleep naturally or on psychedelics or opium. There may be something that triggers the mind. There may be something that, there might be like a diamond shape or something that's similar to snakeskin patterns that it triggers the mind, and then a full form appears, like the imagination takes over and goes, hey, look out, there's a snake there, and it fills in the details. So I'm not too sure about that. I haven't really heard about people talking about that, but I just sort of put two and two together when hearing people talk about it. So,
Ooh.
yeah.
So these are your works?
No, the one on the right is by Alex Gray.
Uh-huh.
It's called Ayahuasca Visitation. And again, so all this relates back to Lewis Carroll in a bit of a tenuous sort of line, I guess you could say. He read Thomas de Quincey, who talked about these apparitions appearing, just like the Cheshire Cat. So it may have given him some idea. He might not even have been aware of it as he was writing, but, he may have gone, oh, yeah, apparitions appear to people that are on opium. So that's my joining of the ideas. So the image on the left there is of what I saw as I was smoking this substance, which was extracted from the acacia tree. So it's called dimethyltryptamine. This was in 1999, so 20 years ago now, pretty much. And I had no idea what was going to happen. So as I was smoking it, as I was smoking the substance, which is highly illegal, but I did it. I'm just going to lie and say I did it in a place where it was legal. So
it's not like this is being live
streamed,
broadcast
no.
or anything.
Yeah. So yeah, this very wrathful sort of creature came up, and you can see there is diamond shapes there. It was very reptilian, and it's a common theme. And I've actually communicated with Rick Strassman, a doctor in America, who in 1995 was able to do the first, or a bit before it, was able to do the first clinical trials of dimethyltryptamine on human subjects. And he was the first to study on psychedelics since the big drug war ban, I guess, I'm not too sure what it was, but probably late or early 70s, I think. It took him 2 years to get approval, I think, or nearly 2.5 years. So I communicated with him, and he's actually used my artwork on some of his online articles, and so that's been fun. And so this was one of the first artworks because I looked online, it's like, there must be other people that experience similar things, using computer graphics to really get the detail, which I could never hand paint kind of thing. And so I made it and put it online, and it went viral. And around the same time, Alex Gray did his version, which was called Ayahuasca Visitation. And we hadn't seen it. It was like within a couple of months of each other. And you can notice the top, how there's that similarity in that oval shape up near the third eye, I guess you could call it. His is more animal. I mean, mine is more animal, and his is more humanoid. It's some interesting coincidences there, I think. And you can see the diamond shapes on the right-hand side there. And here's a couple of other artworks. The one on the left is by Luke Brown, and I think it's called, I can't remember the name, sorry Luke, if you ever watch this, but it's something about feline. So it is a cat-type being that he saw on DMT, I assume. And then the one on the right, it's very snake-like patterns, again, diamond shapes. And that was by a guy who calls himself Titan Droid. So, yeah. Maybe Lewis was inspired by what he read in Thomas's work. So I'm not sure, but yeah, that's my talk. Thank you.
Wow. Do you know, it strikes me that both Nick and Roger have presented imagery that has attempted to convey somehow what a psychological experience is like for the person. So Nick, when you were looking at Roger's pictures just now, did it strike you that this reflects anything to do with neuroscience? So, for instance, the symmetry is one thing that strikes me about those images.
Yeah, I think it has to at some stage, at some point, and I think we're pattern seekers. You know, our brains are all about finding patterns, and we find patterns of things that are meaningful, and our brains are probably pre-tuned in some way to identify things that matter to us. And if you looked at the rightmost article that Roger showed, it pointed out snakes and threatening people are sort of two very prepared objects of concern, and so it's not surprising that we would see things which sort of resonate with that in some way. So, I mean, how could it not be to do with psychology and neuroscience? It's about experience. It has to at some level. So I think the ideas are just fascinating.
I think that something that we've all tried to grapple with tonight is the extent to which Lewis Carroll or Charles Dodgson reflected his own experiences in the work. So you've looked at the migraine issue, and Steph, you've looked at the maths issue and the kind of debates that were happening academically at the time. And Roger, you've looked at the background and the things that he might have been reading in the other texts. And when in my intro, I was also looking at all sorts of other things. To what extent do you think we can see the interpretations of Alice as being something that he intended? And to what extent are we reading into it ourselves?
Well, I think the mathematics is definitely there.
Yeah.
When he wrote about other things, what I've found out while I've been researching this, most of his other work that he wrote was really rather dull. Some of the other books that are in this lovely book that my mother was given when I was born, it really dull that he wrote for children. It was when he was riled and angry and had something to say about the mathematics and the changes that were going against his classically trained mind, and what he saw as the downfall of Euclidean geometry, that he came up with these wonderful characters.
Roger, a lot of your work is about subjectivity. Do you think that it's his subjectivity that we're reading when we read Alice?
Definitely it's looking at... definitely the maths comes into play, so there's definitely the objectivity of that. Back to, like this hero's journey, mythological. I mean, the way I understand it is he made up the story as it went, so he was kind of, he just put this girl in a situation and, just included a rabbit going down a rabbit hole, and now he had to invent a whole pathway of what happens to her down there. So I think in terms of that, I think he just let his imagination run wild, and it's just resonated. Yeah.
And a lot of the mathematical stories and the characters were added after the story he initially told to Alice Little and the story that he gave to her. So the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, some of the other things that happened. I only mentioned some of the mathematics as well. There's a whole bunch of others. So if you want to come and have a chat afterwards, I'll let you know about the continuity principle and some of the inverse jokes that are in there as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot, but I didn't want to overwhelm the audience. But they were added afterwards. So the story that he told on the banks of the Isis to Alice Little and the book that he presented with his own illustrations didn't have all of the rest of these things, and maybe the book would not have been, and that's some of the commentary, wouldn't have stood the test of time if it hadn't have had these extra scenes in there that he added.
Yeah. Nick, do you think that we're looking at one dude's vision, or is it something that we are creating by reading it as well?
Well, it has to always be both, but I know it's unfashionable to say that authors' intentions matter, but I think they obviously do, and you don't need to choose between these ideas really. I think you can say in terms of the Tea Party, it illustrates a mathematical principle. The plane, the things are rotating around it in two dimensions. That's a mathematical idea that reflects his work. The fact that he's chosen characters who might represent people he comes across in his daily life, that's deliberate. The fact that he's got a Mad Hatter and hatters may be mad. The fact of just a general weirdness which permeates all of it, which might reveal a person who's interested in alternative experiences. And I had another slide I cut, thankfully. which is about he was actually really interested in liminal experiences. He was a psychologist. He cared about trance states where he thought fairies. You know, that's built into it as well, and that sort of comes through in his interest in the sort of psychedelic side of things, and maybe has a certain added reality, especially with the stretched human beings, with his personal experience of migraine auras. You know, that's all in there to be found. Now, of course, you can also impose your own subjectivity there. Not every interpretation is equally plausible, but I think what's great about the book, there's so many layers.
That's right. It's interesting that you bring up the liminal states, because when you're talking about the hypnagogic state, a lot of other writers, for instance, Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, have reported that they find some of their most creative visions coming when they're falling asleep or when they're just waking up. I know that I sometimes feel like some of my most exciting ideas come in those states where I'm not really thinking strongly about these things. So also the Edgar Allan Poe poem, "All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream." All right, who would like to ask some questions? Oh, down the front we've got a roving microphone that's going to come, so please put your hand up.
Well, thank you very much. You're kind of touching on the area that I was going to direct my question about, and maybe to Roger and also to Nick, because at the beginning, Mel, you mentioned that Roger would be referring to lucid dreaming.
Well,
and
yes.
he didn't actually get quite to it, but you touched on it just there a moment ago. So I'd like to hear what Roger had to say about lucid dreaming and whether it has any connection with Carroll's writing. And then I'd also like to hear from Nick about the same matter.
Right. I've spoken about lucid dreaming a lot, I guess, with my artworks and publicly, and even just anyone that will listen.
Can you explain what lucid dreaming is, if someone doesn't know?
Sure. And this isn't in any way related to Alice in Wonderland. I didn't have a connection there at all. It's just, that was just my intro that I talk about lucid dreaming. So you can train yourself. It's like a muscle. There's various ways to do it. It's the ability to realise that you're dreaming while you're asleep. So you actually have the realisation, I'm in my bed sleeping right now. And to test it, you actually pinch yourself and it hurts. So it's more real than real in a way. And it can last a few seconds. If you get too excited, it can end. So there's ways to control yourself. I've worked out techniques where I build in my short-term memory. So I'll glance at an object for 2 seconds, this is in the dream, and glance at another object, and do it until I build in a short-term memory of the environment, and then it just locks in. So it's fascinating.
And then you can control your dream.
It's like you have a higher ego, or I'm not too sure the technical terms. You can't just do anything you want. Okay. There's something that intervenes if you... you can't switch on a light, apparently. I've tried. You can't change light condition. It's like we don't have the processing power in a dream state to open a curtain, and it'd be like if you try to open a curtain, there'll be something shut behind it. Your mind will protect you from a change in light, which is interesting.
What's your view on this, Nick?
I think it's fascinating. I think, the division of labour here is that Roger has the experiences and I sort of write boring papers about it.
You can be trained.
Look, it's obviously real, and it's fascinating. And at some level, this is, again, getting to the book. I'm afraid I know nothing about lucid dreams as an area of study. I'm sorry. But, it's sort of a hyper-lucid dream itself. It's a book about a dream. It's all very dreamy. It's got all the elements that people like Sigmund Freud said dreams have. Things turn into other things without anyone really batting an eyelid. Things don't follow any kind of logical sequence. Weird things happen, and we just have indifference towards them. And it's all been deliberately constructed by someone who's an author. So it's not dreaming strictly, but it's definitely dreamy.
Do we have other questions?
I guess it was just a comment to extend on what both of you were saying. I recently attended a seminar about consciousness, and in that they were talking about a state that creative people and in the past and from memory it was kind of contemporary to this person we're talking about, where they would go to sleep holding a rock, and then when the rock dropped they would wake, so that they were there in that kind of creative moment when you've sort of half in sleep and half awake. So it's not quite like lucid dreaming, but it's, that kind of twilight state almost that you get into, and that they would purposely do that to aid their creativity and to think differently.
It can go both ways. I mean, there's other stories. One story about the popular belief of being abducted by aliens is that people are mistaking a state like that where they're actually, their bodies are paralysed in sleep paralysis with the idea of someone being abducted. So I'm not sure I'm going to play that game.
Does anyone have perhaps any scientific or mathematical questions?
No, Harry was going to say why maths is taught in an art subject. I did read about it, but I've forgotten. He will eloquently tell us all.
Well, it's because those of you who have studied maths at school, you've learned how to count and how to enumerate things. But that's not why people study maths, really. It's really about the foundations of logic. The study of mathematics is really about the principles that you need to establish fact and to know when something is really true. And that's the foundation of modern computing and computer algorithms and decision-making processes in computers. And in the middle of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the corners of the Bodleian Library are divided up into the original schools of philosophy, schools of logic, schools of mathematics, and schools of geometry, and it really dates back to the 13th century.
Amazing. It reminds me of how the old-fashioned term for science is natural philosophy, and how maybe there isn't that much difference between philosophy and other forms of inquiry.
No, well, mathematics is really just a language that we place on the world to understand it. And we set our own kind of schema or conceptual schema with numbers, and it's just how we understand it. But if we decided, like when Alice is in the hallway and she does her multiplication wrong, it's not wrong, she's just using different bases. We have base 10. Those multiplications are right, they're just in a different base. And if we'd not had maybe 10 fingers and had 8 like the Simpsons, we would have used different bases, and everything in our mathematics would be completely different today.
Haven't different civilizations had different bases, like the Babylonians or something? Oh, I'm hearing some authority from the from the audience here. Do we have another question?
So I'm in two worlds because I'm a creative, but my grandfather was a mathematician and he also studied at Oxford University. My husband is a CFO. Now,
that's a chief financial officer for anyone in the audience
sorry.
that didn't know.
Sorry. But it's interesting because knowing people that study mathematics, now, and my daughter's a scientist as well, they are very hard to communicate. So they get frustrated sometimes to be emotional. So when I read the works of Alice, sometimes I think that he uses the characters to show emotion, because he's such a shy personality. And because they're so logical, they get frustrated because they can't feel what they want to say, and they want it to be logical. And I know that with my own husband. So I don't know what, what
I
do
have
you think?
an honours degree in theoretical physics. My family is sitting in the back row there, and they would say that I am quite emotional and that I'm pretty good at showing it. So, but I think that Lewis Carroll uses his characters, like I said before, as a way for him to satirize and to show his dismay and his frustrations at the changes that are happening, and he does it in a way that is entertaining, and that the people that were reading it, that were in on the joke, as I said, would have really enjoyed it and had a bit of a laugh, knowing that the rest of us didn't really know what was going on, and they just thought it was a mad tea party that time was missing. Oh, that's strange, time's a person. Or a pig turned into a baby turned into a pig. Well, that's the continuity principle.
Sigmund Freud might have different ideas.
Well, yes.
But he had a way of putting it in layman's terms, so everyone has had fun with what he wrote. And that's the same with Double It when he used words and changed words. I
Yeah,
love
it's
double it.
homophones.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's kind of really fun, you know. And I appreciate. I loved your talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I have to thank Harry for his help with my talk, and Joe, who's up the back there, for the help with the slides as well.
And just on what you said, like when he was on the boat narrating this story to Alice Little, I think there was one of his mates or one of his mathematical friends. So he was telling the story to him too. I think that's what I read somewhere as well. So there was that. Yeah.
We have time for maybe one more question, if anyone has a burning question. I can't quite see with the lights on me. No. Well, I'd love to thank our three panellists for their very expert comments, and I hope that you've found a new way to interpret Alice after this panel. Please join me in thanking Nick, Steph and Roger.